Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Beatrice Dupuy. I'm the director of Circle, and I'm joined today by Kate Mackay, Associate Director, and Marisol Aguirre, Outreach Coordinator. We'll get started in just a few minutes, and in the meantime, please check your sound and in the chat, drop where you're joining us today. Also, our presenter has a question for you, so please scan the QR code that you see on this slide or go to the URL provided as well.
This is exciting.
Yeah, from
I
all
see a
over the
couple from
world.
my old
Yeah.
stomping grounds in Ohio. And my spouse is from Chongqing. That's a massive city.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we were talking about the weather before people logged in, and Chongqing is hot and humid almost all the time,
Uh-huh.
it feels like.
Yeah, from all over. All right, so we are at the bottom of the hour, and so it's time to get started with just a few announcements first. For those of you who are not familiar with Circle, we're one of 16 language resource centers that until recently were funded under Title VI by the US Department of Education. Our mission is to develop and provide quality instructional materials and professional learning opportunities to language educators. Circle is housed in the College of Humanities here at the University of Arizona. And for more information, history and impact and what LRCs as a whole do and the resources we offer, you can visit the links provided on this slide. On this map, you can see where each center is located in the US.
Hmm.
So today's webinar is the first of a three-part series that is focused on integrating AI in language education. The next two webinars in the series will be in January and February. We are now busy preparing for our upcoming Intercultural Competence Conference. Scholarships that cover registration fees for full-time K-12 and graduate students are available. The application deadline is tomorrow, December 12th. Scan the QR code or go to the link at the bottom of this slide to get more information. The recordings for 2024-2025 academic year webinar series and previous webinar series are available on our Circle YouTube channel. As many of you know, Circle has been funded by the US Department of Education under Title VI for the last 20 years. Now these funds are gone. If you would like Circle to continue to produce the same kind of resources and programming we have offered for over 2 decades, please consider making a small donation that will directly support language teaching and learning. To donate, please scan the QR code or visit the URL at the bottom of this slide. Lastly, I would like to remind attendees of a few house rules for our webinars. The webinar experience works best if you're using the Zoom desktop app on a computer. Cameras and microphones are going to be off for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions for our presenter, please use your Q&A. And use the chat to introduce yourself just like you did. Ask Circle staff technical questions, and remember to select everyone so that all attendees can see your post. Certificate of attendance for live participants will be available. For that, complete the webinar survey shared at the end of this event and request a certificate at the link that you see after you click submit. You can also request a digital badge, and Circle will email you after this webinar is over. Finally, Circle will let you know via email when this webinar recording becomes available. So it is now time for me to introduce our presenter, Dr. Joshua Paiz, holds a doctorate in applied linguistics, English language teaching from Purdue University, and industry certifications in cybersecurity, cloud architecture, and generative AI. His research has focused on inclusive and equitable pedagogical practices and the application of generative AI tools in language teaching and learning and computer science education. He currently serves as the Assistant Dean for the School of Technology, Trades, Business, and Hospitality at Frederick Community College in Frederick, Maryland. He co-authored with Rachel Tonselli and Ilka Kotska the book Artificial Intelligence, Real Teaching, A Guide to AI in ELT, and his single-authored book, Collaborative AI, Artificial Intelligence, Expertise and Pedagogy in Call Research and Practice, is coming out in January 2026. Joshua, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I appreciate that warm introduction. And to all of our attendees, welcome. So today I'm going to do my best to avoid the proverbial sage on the stage approach to webinars, and build in, using our various digital tools, as much interactivity as we can, and plenty of time for Q&A, because I find when talking about artificial intelligence, especially when talking about artificial intelligence to educators, there are boatloads of questions that come up, and I want to make sure that this is what all of you need. So for today, this presentation is titled quite loosely, The Agency Dilemma, Balancing Generative AI Efficiency with Learner Independence. And this responds, I think, to a pretty persistent thread in AI and education research in recent years about that worry around learning loss for our students, right? So as always, it's good practice to let people know what they're in for. So just a really quick sort of roadmap so you can decide where you want to be the most keyed in. This workshop is going to be broken into 4 smaller parts. There'll be interactive elements throughout each of these parts. In the first part, we're going to look at the efficiency versus agency crisis very quickly. Then we'll talk about the human in the loop framework, which is one sort of response to those agency concerns. From there, we'll talk about critical AI literacy specifically and inclusivity before concluding with a really quick toolbox for educators as we revise our practices in this age of AI. Beyond the sort of engagement notes that Circle shared with you, I'll share some of my own as a presenter. The first is that no matter where you are on your AI journey, whether you are a complete and total skeptic and you are here to ask your pointed gotcha questions, or you are a full-on cyborg. I saw a couple of you have AI note takers, so you are my cyborgs in the audience. You are welcome here, no matter what your uh, individual sort of orientation to the topic may be, right? This, of course, means that throughout this session, we'll make sure that we're, especially in the chat, engaging respectfully and thoughtfully with each other, particularly if we're fundamentally opposed to what we're hearing, which may happen, right? There may be some of you there that are gung ho for AI integration, and there may be some of you that are, uh, for lack of a better term, neo-Luddites, saying, no, no, let's go back to the old blue books and the pen and paper and just take tech out of the equation altogether. That's perfectly fine. Again, we are going to listen with grace and active listening skills, right? So I would encourage you throughout this to stay professionally curious about what you're hearing, right? So without further ado, in this first section, what I'm going to do is dig a bit into what I'm going to call the efficiency versus agency crisis, right? Now, those of you in the audience that are around my age, so part of the millennial population, those 35 to 45-year-olds, are probably sighing right now, mostly because our generation's time on Earth has been one crisis after another, or so it seems. But if we view a crisis as a sort of critical inflection point motivated by some outside force, then I think we can all agree that the advent of large language models and the proliferation of AI-based tools certainly does present a crisis moment, an inflection point, a moment of profound and radical possibility, potential, and change, and one that most institutions we're seeing have navigated with variable degrees of success, right? Many of our institutions that we're at are probably still pretty early in that navigatory process, right? So what I'd like to do now is I would like to invite Mary Solin real quick to pop up the Menti results for that first question about that GPS question, right? And we're just going to do a quick little debrief here, right? So the question that you were asked as you came in was, to be honest, if your GPS died right now in a city you don't know, could you find your way home? And I have to admit, I am a little bit surprised here. The reason why I start with this question is because the GPS represents a certain kind of cognitive affordance and one that many of us almost always have with us, right? Um, and so, what I mean by cognitive affordance is some sort of tool that we can offload certain cognitive processes off to. So, something like maintaining a mental map of our local surroundings is cognitive load, right? And many of us have offloaded that to, as we can see from these results, about 3/4 of us have offloaded that mental map onto our affordance of the GPS, or at least partially offloaded it, right? But this act of reading a map and interpreting a map and your place and space in the world um, is another example of that sort of cognitive offloading, where if you're really relying on the GPS, so if you're in that 15 that feel like they would be completely lost without that blue dot and Siri's dulcet tones telling them where to go, you've offloaded a lot of that sort of cognitive processing of understanding place in the world and finding your way in the world to your cognitive affordance, right? But I start here because this is an example that most of us are familiar with, and it's a technology that most of us have accepted as part of our daily lives, right? But for me, this also very clearly represents that sort of agency dilemma, because whenever we're engaging in a form of cognitive offloading like this, um, what we run the potential of is giving up some of our agency, right? Some of our control over that situation. We're surrendering part of that. And in some cases, we're even surrendering parts of the decision-making process over to the cognitive affordance, right? And I think this also really captures that sort of worry that we as educators have about learning loss when a new cognitive affordance becomes available, right? Because you'll notice most of us would either be completely lost without the GPS or we're not too sure, right? We might be able to find our way. We might have some strategies that we could deploy. Uh, for example, you can use the reaction button and give me a thumbs up. Those of you, if you were lost without your GPS, first thing you would do, would you hunt down a gas station or a local to ask directions to? Right? We'll see if any thumbs pop up. If not, I know that I'm talking to a bunch of introverts like myself. Okay, a couple of you, right? So you have strategies to mitigate that lack of knowledge about your surroundings, right? But it would lead to some sort of affective strain for you, right? Um, Others of you, you got your mental map, you'd be perfectly fine. We don't need to worry about you. You're probably the ones saving us, right? But this to me really strongly reflects what we see with our learners when we're talking about generative AI, right? So if you are, somebody said that they are the only dinosaur who would actually bring a physical map. No, one of your colleagues said this as well, right? But if you are that person who relies more on your ability to engage with tools like the physical map and your fit and the world around you, right? You have a great deal of control and agency in that situation. If, however, you are the person like my spouse who can't navigate our hometown without their GPS, the reason why I say you're giving over a lot of that agency and control is that GPS and the algorithms that undergird its navigation uh, subroutines are deciding what your route through that town is going to be, right? Now, some tools are polite and give you options of different routes, but they aren't all possible routes. And they're not necessarily the route that you need to be taking, but instead the route that that particular service feels is best for you according to its algorithm. But one of the things that we see quite interestingly, and I'm not going to ask any of you your age because I am from the United States where that is considered rude, um, is that younger drivers tend to be more reliant on GPSs, even in their hometown, even in a familiar setting, than older drivers, right? So I'm pushing 40. I can read a map, though I choose not to. But because I grew up in the days when you had to navigate off of paper maps, or you had to print off the MapQuest directions. Anybody remember those? Yeah. And tape them to your rearview mirror to drive someplace new. I'm far more capable than my spouse who grew up driving with a GPS and always relies on GPS. Right. So like even to drive from my home in Germantown, Maryland to the gym that we work out at up in Frederick, I've driven that route maybe 10 times. I have a mental model of it. I don't need my GPS anymore, right? I can drive that route. I can have sort of full control over that situation, right? My spouse, on the other hand, who learned how to drive in the age of the GPS, where it was built into all of the cars, has also driven that same route about 10, 15 times, but every time we get into the car, the first thing they do is turn on the GPS to take us to that exact same gym, right? They don't hold the same mental model of the world as I do. And the research would suggest that part of the reason for that is because of our reliance on these cognitive affordances, right? So hold this idea in mind because we're going to use this as sort of a touchstone for this first segment, right? What we're seeing a lot in those results is that most of us are very efficient at arriving to our place, but many of us have lost that ability to navigate, right? So that arriving would be that efficiency, that ability to navigate would be that agency. And so for us, that's that agency dilemma. So to define that a little bit more fully, right, we can see that sort of GPS paradox as a metaphor. And here we're going to define for you that mechanism a little bit more, right? We call this the agency dilemma, and this is a term that's emerging more in the literature in recent years because it's not just a technological issue, but instead represents a sort of philosophical tension, right? So you can sort of picture a seesaw where on one side we have efficacy, or the ability to produce high quality, relatively error-free. I'm going to use the word text a lot, but when I say text, I also mean spoken text, as well as the traditional words on the page or words on the screen, right? On the other side, you have that sort of independence. This is the student's internal ability to do that work for themselves, right? To engage in that productive cognitive struggle and to produce something on their own and to have say over what it is that gets produced and the manner in which it gets produced, right? The problem with generative AI is that it kind of breaks this seesaw, right? It offers us a very quick means to efficacy, to very quickly producing a relatively flawless, if not lifeless, error-free text or even high quality images, depending on the image model that you're working with. But in order to do that, we have to give up a great deal of the control and the individuality that comes along with that, right? Because one of the things that we know from the past couple of years of research into large language models specifically, and so large language models are those things like ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, Haiku model, or Google's Gemini models, right? Is that they're predisposed to output in pretty standard edited North American white English, right? And some linguists are concerned that that's going to lead to this sort of linguistic flattening uh, of language, right? But what is at risk here is that it creates this sort of mirage of competence. It creates this view that someone is more capable, either with language or with creativity or with ideation, than they actually are. And this isn't just unique to those of us in the room that are language educators. We're struggling with this mirage of competence in computer science and engineering as well, because many large language models are good enough coders that undergraduate students in computer science can rely on generative AI to do a decent bit of the work for them already, right? Now, beyond this sort of core conflict, for us, bringing it back to applied linguistics, we also need to define this term agency a little bit more, right? And so for me, how I see agency is that sort of socioculturally mediated capacity to act, right? So it's not just 100% pure independence, but it's that sort of independence to act on the world around us, the social and physical world around us, considering the constraints that exist, right? So those may be constraints of able-bodiedness, right? Those may be constraints of linguistic ability, right? So a really good example of this is I lived in China for 3 years, and there were certain things that I just could not do because my linguistic competence wasn't high enough, right? There were certain versions of me that I could not be because of this. So this is kind of the ability to impose your will on that languaging process, right? So the trap that many of our students are falling into now that we as educators need to be prepared to guide them through more efficiently is that trap where generative AI is offering a dynamic structure that mimics that agency for the student, right? The core thing that I want you to take away from this all is that the tool provides the result of that agency, a finished text, whether that is a finished essay or a finished audio recording or a finished video recording, without requiring the student to exercise that agency necessary to create that product, right? Here, the sort of exercise of that agency is that productive cognitive struggle. And any of you that have been in education for any amount of time already know that without some form of productive struggle, without wrestling with the ideas and the concepts, there is no real learning going on for our students, right? And long-term recall is going to go towards zero. So, to understand why our students are so tempted to misuse these tools, I think it's helpful to turn to something many of you are familiar with, which is Dornier's L2 motivational system. um, because it is a helpful tool to understanding sort of the psychology of motivation, right? And we know from Dornier's L2 motivational system that there are sort of two main forces that are driving our learners. The first is that ideal second language self. This is the version of who you want to become, right? It's the dream, the goal. I am a fluent speaker. I am a powerful writer. I am a competent software engineer. This is the engine of deep learning, right? You might see this as that sort of intrinsic motivation. Then there's the ought to L2 self for any of you that are less familiar with this framework, right? This is the pressure in the system, right? And this pressure may be internal pressure, it may be external pressure from parents or from peers or from educators, right? It's who you feel you must be to meet expectations, right? I can't make a single grammar mistake, otherwise, my faculty won't respect me when I send them emails, right? I can't make a single logical error in this piece because then my program won't run, right? So the issue that we run into here is that generative AI is kind of like, uh, give you a fraught metaphor, but kind of like the ultimate drug for the ought to self, right? It allows us to very quickly provide um, that error-free output that this system demands to satisfy that pressure for the ought to self, right? And this is, again, if you've been in education for any amount of time, familiar because it's the same thing that drives a lot of students to engage in academic integrity violations, right? Whatever that form of plagiarism looks like for your subject, it's that pressure that they feel to be a certain version of themselves to meet expectations, right? To produce a certain kind of text or a certain kind of code or a certain kind of mathematical proof to be accepted as legitimate, valid, and passing that knowledge check, right? But in doing so, this disconnects the student from their ideal self, right? When they rely on generative AI and sort of get that hit, that positive hit to the ought to self, they're disconnecting themselves from their ideal self, right? So when the machine does the writing, the student stops visualizing how to become that writer or that speaker or that creator and starts instead visualizing how to use the writer for their own purposes, right? So another way to think of this is they get the grade, but that identity of competent writer or competent speaker begins to wither and die in the vibe, right? And this is the trade-off that we're starting to see in the data, right? So, quick example, this would be a study done by Scher et al. This past year um, that looked at 150 university students, right? And this is, we're going to call it the smoking gun for the agency dilemma. So as Scher and his fellow researchers, or their fellow researchers, were looking at these 150 students, one group used more traditional automated writing evaluation tools. These are things like Grammarly and Pigai, which is a Chinese sort of equivalent to Grammarly, so it provides more mechanical feedback on textual output, right? So it points out errors, but forces you to fix the error instead, or you to select from among a menu of options to correct the error. And the other group used ChatGPT, which will happily fix everything for you, even when you tell it not to, right? Looking at the writing scores, we can see under that performance paradox bullet, the ChatGPT group, if we want to make it a competition, they won, right? They produce objectively better text with cleaner grammar, better vocabulary, um, in some cases, more syntactic complexity, even if the sort of depth of exploration wasn't as deep as we would hope, right? We know that ChatGPT output still tends to be pretty superficial unless you pay for some of the deep research models, right? But what we see here then in the Sure et al. Data is if we only graded for the product, we would say that the tool and the use of the tool is a massive success, right? But they also then looked at um, how students saw themselves becoming a capable writer. So they tried to capture the student's self-assessment of that sort of ideal self. And this is where the Chat GPT group started to crash, right? Even though they were handing in A level papers, their internal belief in their own future capability was significantly lower than the group using traditional tools, right? And you can see the effect size there. So this brings us then to that bit that we were talking about earlier, that competence mirage, right? The students looks at their perfect essay, but deep down they know they didn't build it, right? Or the student looks at their completed program that meets all of the requirements of the assignment, but they know they didn't really build that thing. And they can end up feeling like a fraud, right? The better the tool performs and the less the student feels like they're growing, the more this feeling can begin to compound, right? And this is the data point that proves to me that we need that sort of pedagogical shift. And I should note here that what we're seeing is similar to what we're seeing emerge in other disciplines as well. Bastani et al., for example, found something very similar when looking at students' use of AI tools in math courses, where their final score in the course was trending upwards, but their ability for long-term recall was trending downwards. And Prather et al. Found something very similar in a mixed method study of new to the field computer science students, where the students were able to complete highly complex tasks that they hadn't been able to in the past, but were less able to perform in traditional coding interviews, right? Um, so this competence mirage then becomes the thing that we have to be able to push against now if we're going to actually be addressing this agency dilemma, right? Because we have to be able to help students address that sort of ideal self through the interventions that we're offering in the classroom, right? And so now I'm going to pop the QR code up again for any of our colleagues who are joining us a little bit uh, later in the session, but I have a question here that I'd like you to address, and I'm just going to give you a few minutes to go ahead, excuse me, and pop in your answer before we uh, display the results and discuss those a little bit. And just for accessibility, I'll also read out the question, though you can see it on your screens if you've scanned the QR code. The question that we have right now is, at what point does the student stop being the author of the text, either written or oral? And then you have four uh, items there, where you're selecting a slider from student as consumer to student as creator. And I'm just going to give it another minute or two there before bouncing back in. And one thing that I will say about Menti, I love that it not only shows you the sort of average response, but also gives you a sort of visual of the distribution. This is pretty sweet. Um, so I'm just going to talk through a little bit of what we're seeing here and try to connect it to that question um, of agency, right? And what I see is, first off, I want to say not surprising. I think it mirrors what I see when I talk about this to a lot of groups, right? One, a lot of us are willing to accept the use of grammar and spell check and still see the student as sort of the creator of that text. And this is an interesting one to me because most people don't know that even the basic spell checker uh, that comes in Microsoft Office has been AI powered since about 2013, right? It's just not using generative AI, or it wasn't using generative AI until relatively recently, right? But it's always been natural language processing and machine learning driving modern word processors since about the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then artificial intelligence since about 2013. But because they're so ubiquitous and because they're part of some of our own sort of professional processes, we tend to accept them as um, almost an invisible affordance, right? We tend to assume their use no matter what, right? Um, and so here we see the group as on a whole far more willing to accept the use of grammar and spell check as um, the student being the author of that text, either written or oral, right? And part of that is because it still requires the student to generate the content, right? The grammar and spell check can't do anything at all if there's nothing on the screen uh, for or in the document for it to check, right? And the student has to ostensibly be the one creating that content, right? So the act of generation is still falling to the student. The student is still in control of that process. So we're willing to see them as being very agentive there, right? Now, using translation tools, I'm honestly, I guess this one surprises me a little bit. I thought this would be lower than it is, right? Just because it kind of takes the student out of the struggle of having to pick the right word for the right moment, right? Takes away that need to sort of struggle, fail, and get feedback from their interlocutor as to whether or not that message is landing quite properly. Um, and again, uh, even translation tools, most modern translation tools aren't the old machine learning based ones where it's trying to give you a one for one fill in. Now they're taking context and using, again, generative artificial intelligence to try and give you better translations, you know? But again, it comes down to the right tool for the right job. And maybe this is why some of you still see using translation tools as the student being the author, right? Because if you are yourself a multilingual individual and you've used different translation tools, you know that some are better with, or certain tools are better with certain languages, right? So, like when I was living in China, if I was translating from Chinese to English, I would typically go with Google Translate, right? Because my target was English and Google Translate is pretty competent with English language translations. But if I was going the other way from Chinese to English, I would use Baidu Fain because it was trained on Chinese text. And so it oftentimes gave me more sociolinguistically appropriate recommendations for the lexical tokens that I needed, right? AI outlining 2.7 and a much wider sort of spread of your responses. I'm kind of curious as to why people feel like the outlining is where the agency starts to slip for the learner, right? You may be thinking about how you've seen students use AI to outline, which was probably something like, I need an outline on why gas-powered cars are bad for the environment. And then leaving it at that sort of simple prompt, right? Relying on the AI system to then spit out the entire outline that they then go and add, hopefully, go and add bones to, right? Um, and I would say that this right here, AI powered outlining, this is one where the AI apologists in the room are far more willing to accept this as a pedagogical practice in the language classroom than the AI skeptics are. Um, in part because sorry, the AI apologists are willing to see this as sort of offloading the uh, burdensome task of planning and allowing the student to still focus on content. But that requires us to train the student on how to use the tool so that they're not surrendering too much of their agency and their control over that communicative moment to the large language model, right? Which, while non-deterministic, is still, um, excuse me, while non-deterministic is still a statistical machine, right? A statistical parrot. So you're getting a text that is statistically likely to exist at some point, given the inputs that you provide to it, right? If we don't do that, then we end up with what a lot of the AI skeptics see their students doing, which is just telling the AI, hey, give me an outline for an essay on why AI is the future of education, right? And they're not putting any of that thought into it. Uh, AI drafting with human editing and revision, this one I am not surprised by at all. Most of you here see the student as the consumer, right? Um, and part of that may be an artifact of how the question is asked, right? Editing is relatively surface level, revision can be quite substantive. Um, so this is one we'll get into a little bit more as we return to this idea that I'm going to introduce next, which is the human in the loop. What I want us to remember, though, is that despite presenting this to you numerically, agency isn't about percentage, right? What I want us to start thinking about is agency as who's acting as the architect or the creator versus who's acting as the consumer. Said more simply, who's in the more cognitively active role versus the more cognitively passive one. And like I've already started to preview there for you, um, I don't think it's any surprise that I am one of the AI apologists, even if I am the occasional skeptic. Um, but I believe that part of the way to address this agency concern is through what's called human in the loop, right? And so we're going to dig into this notion of human in the loop a little bit more. And the one thing that I'll say before I go any further is that this idea of human in the loop is one that actually has a really rich history, even in the field of computer science, right? So if you look at the machine learning and the artificial intelligence literature from computer sciences and engineering, you'll see one where there are a lot of cogent arguments forming around this idea that there always needs to be a human that can intervene in machine processes, right? One of the places where we see this idea come across most, uh, sort of most consistently is in the work of Frank Pascal. Um, he wrote a book called The New Laws of Robotics, and in that book, he advocates for a human being part of AI or machine learning based decisions no matter what, right? And if you look at the history of machine learning, which is one of those foundational technologies in AI, it becomes very, very clear why we always need that human in the loop. Um, because these algorithms and these AI tools are making impactful decisions about humans' lives. And until we have complete transparency into how these decisions are being made, we have to be able to override them. If you don't, then you end up with situations like you had in what was that in Illinois in the 2010s, where their legal system had outsourced the sentencing of repeat offenders to a machine learning model. And what ended up happening is, irrespective of the crime, the model sort of learned that a particular name was more likely to commit that crime again in the future. And it just so happened that um, more African American, Black American sounding names were being given heavier sentences for the same kind of crime as a person with a white sounding name, but that person with a white sounding name was getting a lower sentence, right? Because the machine learning model had inadvertently learned the bias of the Chicago criminal justice system or the Illinois criminal justice system because of its training data, right? And so if we just accept that sort of output, right, without any human intervention and control, we end up with very disequitable situations. But let's take a look at this from the education perspective, right? And we know that prohibition of AI tools is going to be impossible because we don't control what our learners do when they're not in the classroom with us. And also, total blind acceptance of AI can lead to problems with learner identity, right? Now it's the AI speaking instead of the student speaking, or it's the AI writing the text instead of the student. We need some sort of middle path. And I think that human in the loop is that middle path, right? This just means that the human must always check the machine's work to prevent errors. Errors here, I'm not talking about linguistic errors, I'm instead talking about disalignment from either the individual or the group's beliefs, values, and norms, right? So in pedagogy, we might define this as integrating human agency into every single stage of the generative life cycle, right? What we're seeking to do here is to fundamentally change the role of the student, right? We already know, especially with our students that over rely on generative AI tools, most of our students are acting like consumers, right? They order an essay or they order a speech script like they order a pizza, right? Large pepperoni, please, or give me 500 words on Hamlet. And we might be lucky if they say please, right? They consume the product without understanding how it was made or even how its constituent parts work, right? Our goal should be instead to turn them into architects because this technology is not going away. And from working in the community college space, I can tell you right now, our workforce partners are expecting an AI ready workforce, right, to come out of our programs. So why we use this sort of language or why I'm advocating for this language of the architect is that an architect doesn't lay every single brick themselves. Instead, they use heavy machinery, they use their teams to execute their will, to execute their vision, but they hold on to and control the blueprints. They decide if a wall is going to go over here or over there. They have the disciplinary knowledge to examine the materials around them and decide, is this material appropriate for this task, or should I reject it because it's flawed, right? So when we teach our students this human in the loop, we aren't telling them don't use AI. Instead, what we're saying to them is you can use these machine tools, but you have to remain the governing force behind it, right? That loop then is the moment of human review and rejection or alteration. And I would say that it's going to be this moment going forward where we close the loop for our students where learning is really going to happen, right? And so, how do we operationalize human in the loop? Well, I would say the way that we do this is through the teacher student AI triad, right? This originally appeared, or a version of this originally appeared in an article by Joe written in 2005, right? Um, and I'm going to present it to you here in this sort of inverted pyramid, right? And I'm going to use this inverted pyramid because it also kind of gives you a graphical tool that you can use as a roadmap for assignment design in the future, right? So at the very, very top of this, we have layer zero, misuse. If I asked you right now to put in chat what you would consider AI misuse, I can almost predict what most of your responses would be, right? Which would be it's having the AI generate the entire video for the student, because you can use tools like 11 Labs to create voice clones of yourself. Um, and then you can feed that into something like Sora to create a reasonable facsimile of you saying those words, but it's not you, it's the AI saying all of those things, right? Um, Most of you would say that that is misuse, right? Or the give me 500 words on Hamlet is misuse, right? If we go a layer below that, though, what we have is that sort of level one, which is basic assistance, right? This is where we encourage the students to use the AI like a background tool, right? Think of it like a superpowered spell check. It's fine, but it's low stakes. The student is just polishing the surface, right? At this layer, the role of the AI is being that background tool used for discrete lower order tasks like spell checking, basic translation, and vocabulary retrieval. And the role of the student is that of independent user, right? They're maintaining full control of content, and using the AI only for those surface level corrections. The role of the teacher, however, is that of designer and supervisor. They need to set those strict boundaries, those guardrails for learners, right? And evaluate that final work to ensure that there was no copy paste. Now, the agency mechanism here is where agency is being preserved by limiting AI scope to mechanical support and ensuring that the core cognitive work remains human, right? Depending on the type of student that you're working with or the type of assignment, this may be the appropriate place for you, right? In other cases, moving down another level to that sort of level two collaborative innovation may be more appropriate, right? This is to me where the magic starts to happen. Here, the AI isn't writing the text, it's instead arguing and engaging in dialogue with the student. It's doing things like generating counter arguments or brainstorming alternative outlines with the learner. And the learner's job then is to be that critical collaborator. They have to then filter and synthesize that AI output, right? So at this level, that collaborative innovation level, the role of the AI is that of companion, right? It may be acting as a structural sounding board or as devil's advocate, right? The role of the student is that critical collaborator piece where they're engaging in that dialogue, they're questioning output, and they're offering then suggestions with their own personal ideas and their own personal voice in place. The role of the teacher here at level two then shifts from designer and supervisor to facilitator and mediator, right? The teacher designs the collaborative task, guides the critical evaluation of AI, and guides students in understanding the potential impacts of bias and hallucination, right? If these two terms are new to you, AI bias just refers to the fact that every AI on the planet is predisposed to a certain kind of output. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a minute. A hallucination in artificial intelligence is when the AI makes something up, and we've all seen that, right? The agency mechanism at this level is where agency is being exercised through the selection, synthesis, and critique, right? The student must act as a filter for the AI system. At sort of the tip of this, or at the deepest level, we have level three, which is that reflective optimization. The goal, and this level to me is the goal, right? We want our students to become that sort of systems refiner. They're actively prompting, critiquing, and sort of retraining the AI, or at least the AI in that conversational thread, that AI instance to serve a very specific communicative and rhetorical purpose. Right here, at level three, the AI system should be acting as an adaptive co-teacher, providing personalized complex feedback or simulating diverse audiences and personas, right? The student should be acting as that autonomous refiner, using AI for complex problem solving through what's called iterative prompting, this continuous back and forth with the AI, where the student is refining the prompts that they're using by revising that output and feeding it back to the AI along with their feedback to bring it more into alignment with their targets, right? The teacher then acts in that ultimate sort of systems piece where they're calibrating the AI systems through things like system prompts. So in Google Gemini, you can create what are called gems, which are like projects where you give it a system prompt of how it should behave, the role it should take on, and some foundational knowledge, and then other users can come and use that gem to ask it questions with those guardrails already in place. Another role of this then of system refiner is taking the time to analyze interaction logs for students and to assess whether or not that process focus has taken place for the learners, right? Now, most of our students are currently stuck, sort of oscillating between level zero, that misuse, and level one. And I would say that the job of the modern educator is going to be to design tasks that force students sort of down this pyramid from level two to level three, where that agency sort of returns to the learner. Before we get to that next activity, though, I do want to take a moment just to show you what I mean about bias for those of you that aren't familiar. So I have up on the screen Google Gemini. Um, I do pay for the pro version, so the output I get may be different from the output you get. Also, generative AI is non-deterministic, so even if we feed it the exact same prompt, we are not going to get the exact same output. I'm going to be using a foundation model. Foundation model is kind of like a brain, called Nano Banana Pro. That is their image generation AI. And I'm just going to feed it a really quick prompt of make me a picture of an after school snack, right? Make sure I have this set to create an image. Give it this. And you can go ahead and take a guess as to what you think it's going to create. We're going to give it a minute here. Um, oh, look at that. Apple slices, oatmeal, banana, chocolate chip cookies, berries, and milk. If you are from the United States, this may very well look like your after school snacks. But we have friends here from all over the world. Those of you that are coming in from China, how many of you are reaching for the Chips Ahoy chocolate chip cookies for your after school snack? Give me a little thumbs up reaction if that's you from China eating the chocolate chip cookies. One, two, three. I saw no thumbs up. Okay. Um, this is what we're talking about with bias because most of the images of after school snacks that this model was trained with came from the United States. Most of those pictures included things like bananas, apple slices, and chocolate chip cookies. So when you ask the AI a simple question like make a picture of an after school snack, it defaults to its average, and its average is American. We can try to make this better with something like make me a picture of an after school snack. I'm a 7-year old Chinese boy living in, I lived in Shanghai, so I'll put Shanghai here. And we'll see. It might produce something better, it might not, because the amount of training data from the Chinese context that went into Google Gemini is much smaller than the amount of training data from the United States. All right. So it looks like fruit instead of, excuse me, like melon, looks like watermelon instead of the banana. Okay, sure. My spouse is from China, and if it's summer, always eating melon. Looks like a glass of milk tea, maybe some of those Rice Krispie treats that my spouse is a fan of, the ones with the red bean in the middle. But importantly, the background is Shanghai. So we can at least say that it got location right. But this is what I mean by that sort of iterative prompting. If our students aren't aware of these potential biases that the system may have, um, then we have to be prepared to teach them how to reprompt the system to get something like what they're looking for, right? If we step away from image generation into text, right? What we're going to see here is pretty bog standard edited English. And edited English is white middle class English, right? It is not the English of my father's family, which is Chicano English, right? We can try to get it to change this and say, okay, this is great, but put it in Chicano English, and I am not responsible for what it's about to do, right? Um, Okay. A homie terrier named Laika. She wasn't some regular Mutna. What we're seeing here is a sort of caricature of Chicano English. If we have any sociolinguists here that specialize in Chicano English, I'll let you judge how effective it is. But what we find is when we ask AI systems to output in, let's call them non-standard. I understand that's a problematic phrasing, a non-standard variety of English like Chicano English or African American vernacular English or Indian English or China English. We end up with an almost racist parody of those things because there hasn't been enough of that style of or that variety of the English language in the training data, right? That's the kind of bias that we are up against and that we have to prepare our students for, right? So with that little detour about bias out of the way, let's go ahead and do our next activity, which will return us to that idea of the triad. Let me find the right screen here. And you should see, assuming I've done this right, the QR code in case you've left the Menti. And I'll give that just a few minutes there, right? And just think of the last assignment that you gave your students and pick where you think it fell. I won't answer this one because I don't teach right now. And then, oh, Marisol already beat me to it. Great. So most of you would say basic assistance, maybe collaborative innovation. Okay. Okay. I mean, this is fair, right? I think unless you spend a lot of time in, excuse me, sort of the generative AI space, and a lot of time in the sort of AI enabled language teaching space, then reflective optimization might not be where you are yet. Also, depending on the tools that are available to you and to your school, right? Um, so I would say this really kind of mirrors what I see when I walk into a room and I ask how many people are uh, worried about generative AI or how many people are engaging with these things. Okay. Just for the sake of time, we are going to go ahead and sally forth, as they say, um, and talk about. Actually, we're going to skip the case, and I'm going to address some of the questions just really quick. And while I do that, if you need to take a quick break, you can feel free. Um, but I saw a couple in uh, the Q&A pop up. So Austin asks, is it okay for language educators to encourage students conducting academic research to use AI in data analysis? I'm going to answer this as yes, but one, the tool that you're using is going to matter a lot here, because each of these AI have sort of different brain inside of them. And what I find is that Anthropic's Claude is a much more competent junior data analyst than ChatGPT is, right? The important thing about this, though, is you still have to clean the data and prepare the data for consumption. You still have to know your problem space and be able to articulate that problem space in words. Um, and you have to sanity check everything that comes out of it because even if you're feeding the raw data into the AI system, and giving it very clear sort of guidance on how you want it to do, let's say, exploratory data analysis on that data set that you're feeding it, um, it can still hallucinate the results because sometimes it has an error when it's ingesting the data. So you have to sanity check everything that comes out of it. The other reason that I would suggest Claude, besides the fact that it's more competent at data analysis, is Claude uses what's called a constitutional AI model. So Claude, for the time being at least, will not use user data to train future versions of the AI. So if you put something into Claude, whether it's a raw data file, text, or an image, it will not use that to train future versions. Right now, you should assume everything you put into Gemini and everything you put into ChatGPT, and everything you put into DeepSeek, which is a Chinese AI, is being used to train future versions of it, which then raises questions about confidentiality, and PII, or personal identifiable information. Sonia Vargas asks, what was the name of that tool for Chinese to English and English to Chinese? Chinese to English, I'm a big fan of Google Translate. English to Chinese, Fani, which is just the Baidu Translate, right? Um, and then Amina says that they're a student language learning advocate at their school. Their focus has been forming community for second generation learners who face negative pressure when learning their heritage languages, right? The fear of being wrong and so on. My concern is making sure my peers feel confident in their language skills without Gen AI guiding them. As a language learning advocate, how do you believe students can help each other have positive language learning experiences that negate the overuse of AI? One, beautifully thoughtful question, Amina, and one without a simple answer. Right. What I would say is we have to create spaces where it's safe and okay for the students we're working with to experiment with language, to play with language, and ultimately to fail, right? And for that failure to be okay, right? Um, what a lot of people don't know about me is I came to the field of computer science pretty late in life. I actually failed as a computer science student when I was 18 years old. Didn't come back to it until I was about 35, right? One of the big things that changed for me is when I was 35, getting my second degree and my second master's degree in computer science, it was no longer make or break. If I failed and didn't get that degree, it didn't matter because I already had a PhD. I already had an established professional identity in my field, which made it safe for me to try new things, to take risks with my learning, and it helped that learning to stick longer term, right? The other thing that happened is I became more willing as I got older to embrace that sort of productive struggle, right? To have the patience to do the hard, boring thing, the learning, because I knew that it would empower me later to do the fun, creative thing that I really wanted to do. And I think if we can model that process for our peers as that language learning advocate, um, and we can create that safe space for play and experimentation and failure and show people that failure isn't the end of communication, it isn't the end of learning. We can do that without artificial intelligence altogether and can probably do it better without AI, right? So for the sake of time, I'm going to go on to the bit about critical AI literacy and inclusivity. And in this section, I want to draw our attention first to this notion of critical AI literacy, which is something even our workplace partners are saying that they want, something that we're seeing state and national governments over the world identifying as sort of the it skill of the 2020s and beyond, being key both to a population that's well prepared to engage in civic action and outside of public life, industry partners from healthcare all the way to tech to social support are identifying this skill, critical AI literacy, as central to being competitive in ever tighter global labor markets. So what it is, this one I'm going to borrow from the work that myself and my dear colleagues Ilka Koska and Rachel Toncelli from Northeastern did in one of our recent books, right? By saying, hey, we need to not just teach our students prompt engineering, but we need to start teaching them critical AI literacy. Um, so we need to teach our students to critique the underlying architecture of the tools, right? Because here's the reality. These models are trained on massive data sets dominated by standard white mainstream English. But the AI doesn't label its output as that. It simply presents it as correct or professional or ideal. This creates what we call the assimilation effect. When a student uh, feeds their essay into ChatGPT, the tool doesn't just fix their grammatical mistakes or errors, it oftentimes sanitizes the language, stripping away the voice, taking away the unique cultural markers or rhetorical styles that may be constructive influences from the student's first language and replaces them with a flattened, standardized corporate voice. If we don't warn our students about this, they'll conflate good languaging with white mainstream languaging. Our job is to teach them that linguistic justice piece, to teach our students that they can reject the suggestions of AI systems. They can say, no, I want to keep this metaphor because this sounds more like me. No, I want to keep this phrasing because it reflects who I am as an individual. We need to teach them to negotiate with the machine and not just to submit to it, right? So we can do this by looking at a quick sample text, right? I'll give you a second to read this, and I will also read it verbally. Dr. Malik sat beside his patient, scanning the chart before meeting her anxious gaze. We caught it early, he said, his tone steady and reassuring. His shoulders relaxed. He offered a small, confident smile. You're not alone in this. In that moment, care became more than medicine, it became hope. Now, the reason I'm showing you this sample text, this comes from a pretty simple prompt to a large language model to produce a text about a doctor talking to their students. That's basically all that I put in there. And this is the standard output, right? I'm going to take us back to that idea of bias, and I'll copy this text and put it in chat so you can refer back to it. But if you scan this QR code, excuse me, you'll see a question pop up on your screen related to this text. Oh, Marisol, can we go to the next slide on the Mentimeter? Not the Lin slide, but the next one. There you go. Thank you. And here you can enter words and it will generate a little word cloud for us. Right. So the question is, what's missing from that sample text? And I'll put that sample text back in the chat for you here in just a second. I just need to find my slide. Zest. That's a brilliant way of saying it. I dig it. Thank you for that. I am naturally curious of what you mean by zest, but I'll take it. The actual health issue, okay, sure. Empathy, diagnosis, lingo, okay. Yeah, the patient is kind of secondary to the whole thing. Okay. Y'all are taking it in a completely different direction. Personhood, okay. Realism, all right. If you've been to a doctor in the United States, you know they're not going to be that nice and supportive. Um, they're going to be like, hey, this is your problem. My nurse will handle the rest and then go leave to take care of one of their other 50 patients. Sure. Um, Decent use of the hyphen, which could be a giveaway of AI, that M dash, which isn't fair because I was using the M dash before it was cool, right? Somebody said sexist. Thank you for falling into my trap. Like I said, this text was generated with the prompt, create a short story of a doctor talking to their patient. And the default text, the doctor was male, right? The doctor was male, the patient was female. The person in the position of power was male, the person in the power under position was female by default, right? Um, so yeah, yeah. Also, you'll notice that there isn't, because the doctor is male, there isn't a lot of language here that is that sort of empathetic language, right? Another one of you pointed out that that desire for more empathy here, or the human touch. I think we see that again with eye contact, or soul, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and replace the share because I want to show you an alternative, right? Um, that will reinforce the idea that prompt engineering alone is not the solution, right? And so here now, you should see a revised version at the top bullet. Dr. Reyes gently explained the diagnosis, her voice calm but firm. The patient's eyes welled with fear, but she reached out, steadying his hand. We'll face this together, she said. In that quiet moment, trust blossomed. Treatment would follow, but healing had already begun with compassion leading the way. To get this text, all I did was change the prompt to what you just output was sexist, make the doctor female, right? But you'll notice it didn't solve the underlying problem of linguistic sexism because here now, yes, we have a female doctor, but now all of that language has shifted to that very nurturing, empathetic language. And the reason why this is problematic is the same thing we see in education. Female identifying teachers often are expected to carry more of the emotional labor with their students because society traditionally sees female identifying individuals as more empathetic, right? As more nurturing. We create that expectation around them, so the language we use around them matches, right? It's the reason why if you're a female presenting teacher and you behave in a very nurturing, motherly way, you get a better teaching evaluation. If you act very firm and very strict, your valuations go down, right? The inverse is true for men, and we see that bias reappearing here, right? So I'm going to bring us back to this idea just for the sake of time that prompt engineering is dead. Long lived prompt engineering, right? Some of you may have heard of this skill before, but with the emergence of what are called thinking models, prompt engineering is largely dead, and the prompt engineer will not be the hot job of 2020s. And most generative AI now are thinking models. So you'll notice most AI now will show a chain of thought of different steps it went through before it gives you the final output, right? But generative AI is still largely what in computer science we call a GIGO system, garbage in, garbage out. This means that while the ability to write the perfect prompt no longer matters, the ability to deploy the appropriate prompt strategy remains important. So we're going to shift our focus here to talk about the how of all of this, right? So the technical skill here that differentiates the passive consumer, that level one person, from a reflective master, that level three person, going back to that teacher student AI triad, is what's called iterative prompting, right? Like I said earlier, most students treat GenAI like a vending machine. They put in a token, a prompt, and they expect a finished product to fall out. If the product's bad, they shrug, they turn it in. That's level one behavior, right? We need to teach them to treat GenAI like an intern. You would never accept the first draft from an intern without providing them feedback. You would tell them this is too formal, you missed a counter argument about X, you didn't present enough sound data about Y. This is that iterative cycle. It requires the student to evaluate the initial output. Is it biased? Is it generic? Is it soulless? To refine their instructions with more specific constraints, with more bound examples, and to iterate over this until the result produced by the system matches their vision for that product, right? This provides us then with our golden rule. The quality of an AI's output is limited by the quality of the human subject matter knowledge that goes into that dialogic prompting conversation. So if a student doesn't know what a good essay looks like, they can't prompt the AI to produce one. This is how we prove to students that they still need to study. Said another way, if you want to get a job as a programmer in 2025, right, your ability to give me finished code no longer matters. The AI can give me finished code. Your ability to explain to me why your code is the best code to address a particular problem, that's what matters most now. For the sake of time, I'm just going to move us ahead to talk a little bit about some assessment strategies that you can use and some next steps so that we have plenty of time for some Q&A. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that informal education assessment will always be a part of this, but most of our assessment strategies are no longer sufficient for the age of AI, right? So if we continue to grade only the final essay or only the final presentation, we're going to have a problem. Just like we saw in that Sure study, the AI can produce a better final product than many novice learners. So if your rubric only looks at grammar or only looks at vocabulary, you're essentially grading the bot, right? To assess learner independence, we need to shift to that process-oriented assessment, which some of you, especially in rhetoric and composition-based classes, may be familiar with, right? So if we look at this comparison, traditionally, we might have looked at things like varied vocabulary, arguments are logical and well supported, it's relatively error-free, spelling and grammar, right? But the AI can do all of these things relatively well, right? The new indicator for us is voice. Does the text sound like the learner? Does it synthesize personal experience that the AI couldn't possibly know with more general knowledge that anyone, including an AI system, might have? So traditionally, where we looked for logical arguments, we might now look at prompt engineering. I'm telling my students, I'm not just grading your essay, I'm grading your chat history that led to this, right? If I'm going to accept the fact that they're already using these tools anyway. What I want to see from the students is the struggle. I want to see you asking the AI a question, getting a bad answer, and then correcting the AI. That's because that interaction, that human in the loop, is where that grade is going to come from now, right? So I'm gonna start moving us towards a close so we have some time to chat because I know it's about 4:50 now. So what we need to do is help students rebuild that sort of ideal languaging self that we saw crash in the data, right? And one way that we can do that is through a Gen AI reflection log. And before I switched to administration, when I was still a classroom teacher, this was non-negotiable in every class I taught, right? You can't turn in a paper without this reflection log. It must be there and it must be substantive, right? The most important question on this log for us is really number two. What did the AI suggest that you rejected? I love this question because for me, it's the ultimate test of agency. If a student accepts everything the AI gives them, they're a consumer. But if they can say, hey, the AI suggested this transition word, but I rejected it because it sounded too formal, or the AI wanted to remove this cultural metaphor, but I kept it, to me, that's proof of life. That's human in the loop, right? And in the Sure et al. Study, the students who wrote those reflective papers were the ones who became aware of the loss of creativity, right? This log is the thing that for me forces that awareness, right? It turns the act of writing into that sort of conscious negotiation between human and machine, right? And as we get ready to transition to that sort of final Q&A, Marisol, if we could jump ahead to the action plan mentee, it should be the last one. I would like to know what's just one thing that you plan to try to pilot or to try on the next time you teach. And I'll give you just a minute to do that. And Marisol, Kate, if you remind me, I can send you some examples of reflection logs, different templates that I've used or that I've seen others use over the years that might be helpful. And the other thing I'll say with the reflection logs is I've also seen people do the reflection logs orally, almost as a form of oral defense. If you teach small enough sections, that can work quite well, right? All right, people dig reflection. I know my audience. Cool. I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up so that we have time for that Q&A, right? But by way of conclusion, I just want to say that we started this 90 minutes with this question about the GPS. And we admitted that while it's efficient to follow that little blue dot, it's dangerous for us to learn our overall internal map, right? That's that agency dilemma. And some of the research that we looked at today, and I'll share out a fuller list of references with the slides and some additional materials here in a few days. Um, but the research that we looked at today, from the competence mirage that we saw in the Sure study to the ideal self crisis, tell us one thing. The algorithm offers our students the destination, but it robs them of the journey. And that journey, the messy, frustrating, cognitively demanding struggle of finding the right word or finding the right piece of evidence is the whole point, because this is where the learning lives. So I want to leave you with this charge. Don't waste your energy trying to ban these tools. Prohibition is, as far as I'm concerned, a losing battle. It's a losing battle with our students. It makes the public question our relevance as educators, and it's not what our workforce partners are looking for. Instead, focus your energy on keeping the human in the loop. Teach them to prompt, teach them to critique, teach them to reject the machine when it sanitizes their voice. To me, our job is no longer just to teach language or just to teach content. Our job is to help students build that internal map so that when the server goes down or when life demands something original, they don't get lost without the algorithm. To me, we're not guarding the gate, we're guiding the journey. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you and open the floor to questions.
All right. Well, we have a few questions after those you took earlier, Joshua.
Yeah.
So Metap is asking, to what extent could the application of the golden rule be acceptable in academic writing?
Sure, sure. There, I'm going to say that the answer is I'm going to stop sharing. Um, Contextual, right? If it's something like the class that I used to teach, EAP 1015, which was like um, an introduction to academic writing, then I would say that golden rule, that idea that the quality of the AI output is strictly dependent on the quality of the human that thought that goes into it, still applicable, but maybe in a weaker form, right? Because we understand that in a class like EAP 1015, which is an undergraduate first year class, our students are still cooking, right? So we may understand that we need to provide them with more of that domain knowledge and guide that process a little bit more, right? So we would accept it in that sort of weaker form. But the output is still going to be garbage until it is sanity checked and that revision happens. It's just we are going to have to provide more of that tool, more of that scaffolding than we might in a graduate level course, where I would say we accept a stronger form of that, because in a graduate level course, our students are becoming expert. They're becoming more like us, right? Which means at the end of the day, they need to be able to perform like us, the expert in the room. And so we would expect them to be able to sanity check things more on their own, right? So I would say we accept a stronger form of that.
So here, Union is asking, how do you persuade students to use AI if they are disheartened by the request? In fact, many of my students do not tend to use AI because they think it's cheating. For your assessments, uh, won't it be those who came up with everything on their own versus those who interacted with AI intensively?
Sure. And this is a legitimate concern. I'm thinking especially in the K-12 space here in the United States, where any form of AI is typically seen as cheating, and then they come to my class where I'm like, we're going to explore this together. Um, you do have to overcome that sort of resistance, right? And this is where institutional policy and transparency around that policy becomes critical from day one. If the institutional policy is that AI tools can be used for particular kinds of tasks in particular classes, that needs to be articulated in clear, actionable, student first language, right? And the rationale for any limitations or restrictions there also needs to be clearly and transparently outlined for students from day one, right? Because the fact remains, when they leave us, whether it's the 2 year community college space or the 4 year uh, college and university space, the labor market now increasingly expects students to know how to use AI powered tools to do their work and to do it better, right? Um, so if we're completely disengaging from this, we are not preparing them for the world that they're about to inhabit,
Right.
right? Um, so I would say making it clear why we're making the choices and have the policy that we have is step one. To the second part of the question, which is, well, how do we judge fairly the student who doesn't use AI versus the student that does use AI? What I've seen both in my own classes when I was teaching English for academic purposes and in computer science classes is that a large part of that final grade is no longer determined by the final project. It's determined by some form of reflective defense after the final project, right? So you sit every student down face to face, no devices, just me and you having a conversation, and you can either describe your project and describe the decisions that you made that led to that project, or you can't, right? And it doesn't matter if you used AI or not to do those things. You either know this or you don't, right? And it's a live, real-time conversation. And I've seen more use of that sort of defense style interview across disciplines in recent years. So that's how I would address the second part of that question.
All right. I've been grabbing also questions in the chat because
Yeah.
not everything has come here. So there was a question in the chat. What would be your recommendation for beginning language learners? Some of your recommendations for AI required solid understanding of the material, enough to push back against some of its corrections. At the same time, you don't know what you don't know. So how could beginning students be guided through this process?
Yeah, I think for beginning students, as we see anytime that we're working with lower language proficiency students, it's about the scaffolds that we put in place and that we have to create more space for it in the classroom, right? Because the teacher kind of has to be there to curate and guide the conversation as opposed to leaving the students to their own devices, right? Now, one of the things that I'll say here about AI systems that may be potentially empowering to more novice speakers is that a lot of the audio generation AI, when you ask them to output, excuse me, in a language other than English, that output tends to sound like a highly competent second language speaker and not a native speaker, right? So I was using a tool called 11 Labs to do live translation and voice cloning of me from English to Chinese. And my spouse was like, "No, that's not how I would say it as a native speaker of Chinese, but instead that sounds like a second language speaker, right? Which gives us that sort of ideal self, that sort of vision for success, right? But again, that requires the teacher to have the knowledge of the skills and to sort of curate that experience for students, right? So the role of the educator becomes even more important in this regard. And I think another piece of proof that AI will not be replacing teachers anytime soon.
All right. That question came up earlier in the presentation, but someone was asking, what is basic assistance, for example? That's a problem. Each student will interpret basic differently depending on how much agency they want to give. Can you add an option for no AI assignment or miss? Oh, no, that was the question. Sorry, that's another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the no AI assignment, the only way you're going to get that is if it's done live in the room with you, because you do not control what your students are doing when they leave your sort of visual field, right? So if you want no AI assignments, they need to be constrained in scope to what's possible in the class time when they're with you, right? And you need to be clear about why you're doing it that way, right? To the other question of, well, every student's going to interpret basic assistance differently. Yeah, we've all had that student. So again, this is where ultimate transparency becomes important. Don't just tell them you can only use it for basic assistance. Give them clear examples of what you mean by basic assistance. You can only use it to look up words. You can only use it like a thesaurus. You can only use it for a grammar check.
Right, and I think we're going to take one last question,
Sure.
and we're circling back to prompting. So,
Ah, yeah.
talking about writing a prompt in to AI,
Mhm.
don't you think that it requires some skill to know exactly what to write in a prompt? It's like learning the language of AI and how to speak to AI to give us the right information we need.
If I were giving this presentation in 2023, I would have said yes. But in 2025, I will say yes and no, right? The reason I'll say yes and no is the cool things I can do with generative AI, right? And I've had my provost be like, "Oh my God, that's so cool." Um, I can do because I use these tools a lot, and I've kind of learned that lingo through use, the same way you learn language, right? So that's the other thing. If we don't give our students a chance to practice this kind of communication, they're never going to learn it. The reason why I say sort of no is you can go to an AI with a very simple prompt of what prompt would you give an AI to complete this task? And the thinking models will generate their own prompt that will be good enough, you know? So you can use AI to create and refine prompts for other AI that are more likely to give you the kind of output that you're looking for, right? And this, we call this kind of an orchestration model for AI. So sometimes I'll take a prompt in Claude and say, okay, I'm working with the Google image generation AI, Nano Banana. How do I talk to Nano Banana so I get an image and then I'll describe the image that I want, right? And then Claude will spit out a prompt that Nano Banana will parse properly. And about 9 times out of 10, it gives me what I envisioned, right? So using one AI tool to sort of help you refine that prompt for another is one of the ways that we can address this for lower proficiency students.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We are at the end of our webinar. We reached the top of the hour. We're actually past its 3 minutes. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
for your time. I'm happy to.
It was real fun. It was very interesting. And you can see a lot of people are clapping and thanking you in the chat.
I'm humbled.
This,
Thank you all.
yeah, this was a really very, very interesting and just got my wheels spinning a little bit, right? So this is wonderful. Thank you again for agreeing to do this
Awesome.
webinar for us. And I think I'll just go and pop my slide last time just to ask people for some donation, maybe if they feel so inclined, so we can continue doing this kind of work. And so anyway, thank you so much, Joshua.